Well, good evening and welcome to Ratio Christi South Africa, and welcome to our online symposium, which we've been running now for 2 weeks. And welcome to all of those who'll be joining us on YouTube. Um, uh, who is Ratio Christi? We're a student campus organization that has chapters at universities across the world. Here in South Africa, we have 5 chapters at the University of Pretoria, Stellenbosch University, Rhodes, University of the Northwest, and UKZN Maritzburg campus. And so we are a ministry that exists to serve Christian students and professors on campus by helping them understand reasons for the Christian worldview, examining the various arguments for the faith, be they historical, philosophical, theological, or scientific arguments for reasons for faith, in the effort to try and help Christians better understand the reasonableness of Christianity and to improve the conversations that Christians have with those around them who don't share the Christian worldview, and also to provide an opportunity to share the gospel with those who don't know of the salvation that is offered through Jesus Christ. So we're an apologetics and an evangelistic organization, and we have also developed a local South African website. So if you get a chance, take a look at our website, ratiochristi.co.za. We have a lot of free articles and ebooks on there that you can pick up. And also we do produce articles pretty much on a weekly basis that come out tackling all kinds of topics. You can go and check out our website there. We also have our RC, Ratio Christi South Africa YouTube channel, where we have a growing number of subscribers. I'm going to ask that you would consider subscribing to our YouTube channel, where we also have a growing library of interviews and talks that we've done with scholars from all over the world on all kinds of interesting and contentious and not so contentious subjects. So do feel free to check out our YouTube channel. And please also recommend Ratio Christi to young people, especially high school students and university students. But of course, the information we have is there for all to take advantage of. And we ask that you would recommend us, pray for our organization, and if you feel led to do so, consider supporting us in the work. We are delighted this evening to be joined by our second scholar from the Discovery Institute, Dr. John West. Dr. John West, good evening to you and welcome to Ratio Christi South Africa.
Good evening, Simon. I'm delighted to be with you. Wish I could be there in person.
Yes, well, hopefully maybe in the future you can pay us a visit. We would love to see you. Yeah, we've had a few of the Discovery scholars visit us in recent years, but we would love to see you over here. But we're very excited about the lecture this evening. But before I do it, let me just do a brief introduction for you. I do have your information here for those who want to know who you are. Dr. John West is Vice President and a Senior Fellow at the Seattle-based Discovery Institute, where he also serves as Managing Director of the Institute's Center for Science and Culture, which he co-founded with philosopher of science Stephen Meyer in 1996. His current research examines the impact of science and scientism on public policy and culture. His other areas of expertise include constitutional law, American government and institutions, and religion and politics. John was previously an associate professor of political science at Seattle Pacific University, where he chaired the Department of Political Science and Geography, and he has taught political science and history courses at California State University, St. Bernardino, and Azusa Pacific University. He has written or edited 12 books, including most recently the expanded edition of Darwin Day in America, How Politics and Culture Have Been Dehumanized in the Name of Science, The Magician's Twin, C.S. Lewis on Science, Scientism and Society, and Walt Disney and Live Action. Dr. West, it is a delight for us to have you here this evening. You are now open to share your screen and plunge into your lecture for us tonight. And after Dr. West has done his lecture, we'll have some time of Q&A with him.
Okay, let's see. We will share. And is the screen up?
Yes, we can see it. You're good to go.
Fantastic. Well, it's, again, just really, I'm delighted to be with all of you. And Ratio Christi, in my view, is one of the most important organizations, certainly here in the United States, and also, I think, worldwide. It's fantastic that it's doing so much. And so I think as a sort of self-identified evangelical Christian myself, I just preparing the future and equipping young people, equipping the leaders of the next generation is so critical to be salt and light. And Ratio Christi, unlike some, is not avoiding the hard questions. It's dealing with the hard questions and helping people to think through them with their hearts and their minds. And so this is a delight to be with you. So, I want to start by telling you of an experience I had. It was a few years ago. It was a couple of hours before midnight, and I was standing with my teenage daughter and son in a place called Paradise, which is actually in Washington State in the United States where I live. Paradise is about 1,600 meters above sea level, and it's just below the mountain you see there called Mount Rainier, which is an alpine peak that is almost 4,400 meters high. The sky was so clear that when you looked up, we could actually see along the spiral arms of the Milky Way galaxy. And for someone like myself, who lives in a pretty populated area where artificial lights obscure the hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy, the experience was really awe-inspiring. And it gave me the feeling that we human beings are part of something far greater than we can usually conceive. And maybe you've had such an encounter. I think many people have at some point in their life. Well, nearly 2 centuries ago, a young Charles Darwin had a similar experience. The year was 1831. He was 22 years old, recently graduated from college. He wanted to explore the ecosystems of the world. So he joined the expedition of the HMS Beagle in its voyage to South America and beyond. 2 months later, he was walking in the midst of a Brazilian rainforest, confronted by the sheer beauty of what he saw. Darwin experienced this overwhelming sense of awe. As he wrote about later, he said, surely, he thought, man was more than just a mere animal, and that there was some greater purpose behind nature than mere physical survival. Unfortunately, Darwin's sense of awe about nature and about human beings didn't last. Fast forward to the ending chapter of his life as he wrote his autobiography. Reflecting on this earlier sense of awe in the rainforest, Darwin now wrote that not even the grandest scenes in nature would inspire the view that he had earlier. Now, why is that? Well, he explained that the evidence of exquisite design and purpose that he once found in nature failed now that he had discovered his law of natural selection. Now, there are many different influences that shape our culture's view of human beings, but I have become convinced that one of the most significant really is modern science in the form of Darwinian biology. Darwin's theory isn't just an academic exercise. It has real-world implications for how we understand our world and each other. But to fully grasp that impact of his theory on our view of human beings, I think we need to understand the 2 main prongs of his theory. First, Darwin proposed that all creatures, including you and I, have descended with modifications from one original, simple, primordial organism. And then second, Darwin proposed that human beings and the rest of nature were produced by a process of natural selection, or sometimes called survival of the fittest. Now, according to modern Darwinian theory, randomly occurring mutations and recombinations in genes produce variations among organisms in a population. Some of these random variations will help organisms survive and reproduce more effectively. Over time, these beneficial variations will come to dominate a population, and then over even more time, these beneficial variations will accumulate, creating entirely new biological features in organisms. Apart from its contribution to science, Darwinian theory has fueled 3 big ideas in culture that have had, in my view, significant negative consequences for our view of human life. The first idea is the idea that humans aren't special. According to Darwinism, humans have the same origin as rats and fleas and toadstools, and we aren't fundamentally different from other animals. Darwin himself recognized that his theory diminished the case for human uniqueness, writing in one of his notebooks that it's absurd to talk of one animal being higher than another. Elsewhere, he complained that people often talk of the wonderful event of intellectual man appearing, human beings with their reason, when, in his words, quote, the appearance of insects, flies and mosquitoes, with other senses is even more wonderful. So, human beings and their rational faculties, not so special, not all that wonderful. The appearance of insects is even more wonderful. Now, Darwinian biologists today relish emphasizing that humans are just another animal. Biologist Charles Zucker says that, and these are quotes from various scientists, Charles Zucker says that in essence humans are nothing but a big fly. Geneticist Glenn Evans claims that the worm represents a very simple human. One science journalist in the United States writes that genetics shows that there isn't much difference between mice and men. And a late, now deceased evolutionary biologist named Morris Goodman liked to insist that we humans appear as only slightly remodeled chimpanzee-like apes. This is pretty much garden variety Darwinism. In the Darwinian view, humans are not unique. We aren't special. So that's one of the big ideas that Darwinism helped really push into culture. A second big idea fueled by Darwinian theory is that humanity is the product of a blind, unguided process. As Darwin himself made clear, natural selection is an unintelligent process that's blind to the future. In Darwin's own words, there seems to be no more design in the variability of organic beings and in the action of natural selection than in the course with which the wind blows. Natural selection cannot select new features based on some future goal. It only favors traits that are beneficial to survival now. As a result, evolution by natural selection is the result of an unguided, unplanned process. I'm now quoting the words of 38 Nobel Prize-winning scientists who declared this, that evolution means we're the result of an unguided, unplanned process. These Nobel laureates made this statement in 2005 when they issued a statement celebrating and defending Darwin's theory. So according to Darwinism, amazing biological features such as the human eye or the wings of butterflies or the blood clotting system that helps us survive are in no way to be regarded as the purposeful result of evolution. Rather, they're the unintended byproducts of chance and necessity. And the same holds for higher animals such as humans. In the words of the late Harvard University evolutionary biologist George Gaylord Simpson, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. In the Darwinian worldview, you and I are accidents of natural history, not the purposeful creations of a loving creator. Now, the third big idea fueled by Darwin's theory is that the great engine of progress in the history of life is not creativity, it's not a loving creator, it's actually mass death. Instead of believing that the remarkable features of humans and other living things reflect the exquisite design of a master artist, Darwin portrayed death and destruction as our ultimate creator. As he wrote at the end of his most famous work, thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, directly follows. We're going to tease this out a little more, but just think of it for a moment, that thinking that mass death, famine, war, all these things that traditionally human beings have regarded as evils and Christians have regarded as part of the things following the fall, that Darwin elevates these as our creator. Our creator isn't God, it's war, famine, death. That's what created all the good things. This is, I would submit, a rather dysfunctional, negative, brutalized, really depressing view of nature. A really hopeless view of nature. But that's, in the Darwinian view, that's where the good things come from. Now, overall, these three big ideas that Darwinism has helped spawn on our culture, I think, have been corrosive of our culture's understanding of the human person in at least three ways. It's eroded the sanctity and value of human life. It's eroded our conceptions of morality and ethics. And ultimately, it's also eroded and undermined our belief in God. And so we're going to examine each of these areas in turn with some amount of examples and details. So the first area we want to look at is the erosion of the sanctity and value of human life and how Darwin's theory impacted that. So we don't have time today to explore all the ways that Darwinian theory has eroded the value of human life, but I want to discuss several of them. One way it has done this was the encouragement of what's been called scientific racism. Have to be clear, Darwin was not the world's first racist. There were many racists before him, many after. There have been many racists who have identified as Christians, sadly. But having said all that, Darwin's theory unquestionably, historically, it really is beyond reasonable doubt, has exerted a powerful influence on the development and growth of what has become called scientific racism. As Harvard evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould admitted, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859. That was the year Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species. But they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Now, why was that? Well, Darwin thought that his theory of natural selection provided a scientific explanation for why different races should have unequal capacities and why there were higher and lower races. So if you think about it, the traits that an animal needs to survive is going to differ based on the animal's environment. This was Darwin's argument. So in Darwin's view, there's no reason to expect that natural selection acting on different populations is going to produce the same traits in every population, or in this case, every race. Now, if you have a biblical worldview and think that God created all of humanity and planned them, you'd have a basis for thinking, well, that there should be some racial equality. Everyone's created in the image of God. But remember, in Darwin's theory, our particular capacities are a fluke of history based on the interplay between random variations and the survival needs in our particular environment. And so in a Darwinian sense, there's actually no reason to believe that different human populations growing up in different environments, they'll have different selection pressures. And so natural selection, you'd expect in a Darwinian view to actually act differently on different human subpopulations and human races. And so you should actually, according to Darwin's theory, expect significant differences in the capacities of different races. And so accordingly, in Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, which was one of the books that followed his On the Origin of Species, where he actually addresses specifically what his theory means for human beings. In the book, The Descent of Man, Darwin declared that there are significant differences in the mental faculties of what he called men of distinct races. He also argued that the break in evolutionary history between apes and humans came between and I'm quoting him now, the Negro or Australian, by which he meant the Australian Aborigine, and the gorilla, thus depicting blacks as the closest human beings to apes. Darwin's supporters further popularized these ideas. In Germany, we had a scientist named Ernst Haeckel, who was a friend and correspondent of Darwin, and probably one of the most celebrated champions of Darwin's theory in Germany in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Haeckel produced this widely disseminated diagram of human evolution. According to the diagram, the highest humans are supposed to be white Europeans. The lowest humans are clearly intended to be black Africans. And then Haeckel asserted in his explanation of this diagram that the difference between the highest human and the lowest human is larger, much larger. If you note, there's several other races between them. So that gap, the gap between the highest human and the lowest human, was larger than the difference between the lowest human and the highest ape-like creature. So this is a pretty shocking diagram, but ones like it appeared in countless biology textbooks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both throughout Europe and also in the United States. this kind of Darwinian racism had horrific real-world impact in a lot of different areas. One of them was actually Western colonialism throughout Africa. But its impact on German policy in Southwest Africa, which is modern Namibia, in the early 1900s was especially horrific, where it led arguably to the first genocide of the 20th century. So from 1904 to 1908, the German military attempted to eradicate the Herero and Nama peoples in Southwest Africa. Again, this is modern Namibia. In October 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as his extermination order, declaring that the Hereros either had to leave German Southwest Africa or faced extinction. Herero men would be executed, Herero women and children would be driven into the desert where they would die of starvation or dehydration. Now, how is this justified? Well, von Trotha, the German general, justified this extermination campaign by an explicit appeal to social Darwinism, telling one newspaper that human feelings of philanthropy and basically compassion could not override what he called, and I'm quoting, the law of Darwin's, the struggle of the fittest. So the extermination of the Hereros and the Nama peoples in Namibia was justified explicitly in terms of the law of Darwin. And on this slide, you'll also see in the lower left-hand corner, they're actually taking skulls. So this was another part of really what happened. So as a later part of the extermination process, they rounded up many Herero people in concentration camps, and they actually performed medical experiments on them. This is in the early 1900s. This is 2 decades before Nazi Germans. This is the biology of, I actually did a documentary on this called The Biology of the Second Reich. So this was pre-Nazis. In the early 1900s, they rounded up the Herero Namas people, and they put them in concentration camps and did medical experiments on them. And then when they died, they actually exported their skulls. And that's actually, this is a picture contemporaneous at the time, where they're actually taking the skulls from the dead people that they killed, and they're boxing them up. And what did they do? Well, they sent them back to Germany for scientists to study as part of German racial science. This is actually part of the background to the rise of Nazi ideology in Germany. But this was, 2 or 3 decades, actually more than that, before the rise of the Nazi Party. Anyway, of course, there were also impacts of Darwinian racism in many other parts of the world, not just Africa, including North America, where I live, which I want to talk about. In the United States, our immigration restrictions imposed in the 1920s were largely devised in cooperation with Darwinian biologists who decided that certain races were lower on the evolutionary scale and so should be kept out. You can actually see on this screen in the left-hand side, there's something called the biological aspects of immigration. This is actually an official document of hearings that were held before our Congress in the 1920s to determine, well, why should we keep out certain immigrants? And they were providing a Darwinian rationale for that. More generally, throughout the United States and Europe, there were displays that modern scholars refer to often as human zoos. These displays involved the public exhibition of indigenous peoples as lower stages of evolution, or sometimes even as missing links between humans and apes. And for example, in 1904, there was a huge World's Fair in the city of St. Louis in the United States. And they put thousands of indigenous people. They sent people out, scientists, to gather indigenous peoples from around the world, from Africa, from Asia, from South America, to then put them on display in the World's Fair. This included a group of men from the African Congo, who were referred at the time to as pygmies because they were smaller of stature. They weren't that tall. These African men were explicitly identified during the fair as an evolutionary missing link and described as the humans closest to apes. And here is an actual newspaper article from the time, 1904, in the United States, about this display at the World's Fair. And you can see it says, "Pygmies may be the missing link. Little people from Africa may shed light on Darwin's theory, and then underneath that said characteristics of ape. I'm going to actually quote from this article, which is rather offensive, just to show you I'm not making this up. This is how it was actually described at the time. I'm not imposing my worldview on here. I'm just recounting what they said. And so here's what that article said. So you just saw a screenshot of the article. Here's what it said. Will the pygmies brought last week to the World's Fair prove Darwin's theory of the missing link? Will a study of the little black children of the African jungles shed light on the theory evolved by Darwin as regards the evolution of the human race? Dr. W.J. McGee, who, by the way, was a leading anthropological scientist in the United States at the time. I mean, he was at the very top of his discipline. So Dr. W.J. McGee, chief of the anthropology department of the World's Fair, is convinced that it will. Students and scientists incline to the same opinion. And then the article goes on to say, many characteristics were noted in the pygmies that closely resemble the ape or simian type. It's believed that the pygmies, who are said to represent the lowest form of human development, are next removed from the simian family. Now this is, I don't think I need to say, this is horrifically offensive, and this is the way people thought, and they specifically tied it to Darwin's theory, because Darwin's theory, they thought humans were descended from ape-like creatures, and that the first humans were the most ape-like, and so they tried to figure out, well, which races are closest to our stem with the ape-like ancestors, and in this case, they were actually arguing that these African men from the Congo were. If that wasn't bad enough, 2 years later, in 1906, one of the African men exhibited in St. Louis was then put on display at one of America's most prominent zoos, the Bronx Zoo in New York City. They put this man, whose name was Otabenga, on display in an actual cage in the monkey house, along with a monkey, and represented him as an evolutionary missing link between humans and apes. The exhibit attracted nearly 250,000 visitors. I tell this story in the documentary that you can watch for free on YouTube, Human Zoos. And interestingly, it was the ministers at the time, both a prominent white minister and then many black ministers in New York, who actually pushed against this, that it was dehumanizing, that no human being is like an ape, and that this was wrong. It was the scientists, the evolutionary scientists, the leading newspapers like the New York Times, who actually justified this. It's an interesting story, really horrific story, but it does show the real-world impact of these ideas. Okay. This idea that non-white races represented a throwback to lower stages of evolution was widely embraced throughout the scientific community in the early 20th century, in Europe as well as the United States. Consider the views of biologist Charles Davenport, who was a member of America's National Academy of Sciences and who is regarded overall as one of the founding fathers of modern genetics. He was obsessed with the idea that some races were still stuck in lower evolutionary stages. I write about that and his views in my book, Darwin Day in America. Now, fortunately, most members of the scientific community today have moved beyond these views, but not everyone. This man, you might recognize him, is Nobel Prize-winning biologist James Watson, the co-discoverer with Francis Crick of the structure of DNA. So one of the top scientists of our own generation. In 2008, he sparked an uproar by suggesting that African blacks are biologically inferior to European whites. He further suggested, and so that actually got out into the news media, but what often didn't get reported, well, why was he actually arguing this? You have to actually go to one of his books and some other things to actually see why he claimed that African blacks are inferior biologically to whites. Here's what he actually said. Why is this the case? Because there is no firm reason to anticipate that the intellectual capacities of peoples geographically separated in their evolution should prove to have evolved identically. This is basically the argument that I talked about before. In a Darwinian sense, if humans are simply the product of chance and necessity in history, not the products of design of a loving creator, then, as Watson says, there's no firm reason to anticipate that our intellectual capacities of different human groups that are geographically separated in their evolution should prove to have evolved with identical capacities, because, again, the only thing that gives us the capacities are how we evolved, how natural selection operated in the environment that our ancestors, had to deal with. Again, fortunately, this view has largely been discredited in the scientific community. Unfortunately, and I can't speak to Europe or elsewhere, but in the United States, there are fringe groups today of white supremacists who are trying to resurrect these Darwinian arguments for racism explicitly. They're known in the United States as the alt-right. They're not a big fraction in the United States. They're really a fringe group, but it is interesting how they have basically they've grabbed onto these arguments made by evolutionary biologists in the first decades of the 20th century as a way of justifying their views. However, scientific racism is not the only way Darwinian theory has eroded the value of human life. I would say Darwinism played an even more critical role in the development of a dehumanizing scientific crusade known as eugenics. Now, eugenics was described by its proponents as the self-direction of human evolution. The inspiration for eugenics sprang directly from Darwin's theory. In Darwin's view, the key reason, again, that humans developed their outstanding capabilities is not because they were designed that way by a creator, but because natural selection ruthlessly weeded out the unfit. So the problem, according to eugenists, was that in the name of humanitarianism, particularly Christian humanitarianism, civilized societies were now doing their best to care for those who nature would have killed off. And they thought that is going to lead to disaster. And in The Descent of Man, Darwin himself criticized modern society for methodically undermining natural selection's process of elimination by offering asylums for the mentally ill, homes for the handicapped, hospitals for the sick, and welfare programs for the poor. Darwin even warned about the dangers of vaccinating people against smallpox because he thought that preserved thousands who, and I'm quoting him, who from a weak constitution would have formerly have succumbed. So the idea is that these people were weak and nature would have killed them off, but now we're preventing nature from doing its work of making people fit, and this was going to be awful. And so this was Darwin's stark conclusion, a direct quote from his book. Thus, the weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind, meaning that we're counteracting natural selection now by helping the poor, saving the sick. So what we're doing is we're counteracting natural selection, and the civilized societies are just propagating their weakest members. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. This is pretty stern stuff. Now, I do want to say, Darwin was a fairly kindly man, and so he was torn by the implications that he wrote about here. And he actually goes on to say that he thought that human sympathy wouldn't really allow people to follow his theory to its logical conclusion. Likewise, many of his followers believed it would be too cruel for humans to go back to the law of the jungle and just allow people to die. So they wanted to develop a kinder, gentler way to mimic natural selection through modern science. Thus was born eugenics. Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, is generally recognized as the official founder of eugenics, and he actually coined the term. Positive eugenics focused on encouraging those deemed the most biologically fit to reproduce more, while negative eugenics focused on stopping reproduction by those deemed unfit, including the mentally handicapped and criminals. Eugenics became the consensus view of the world's scientific community for decades, and it was promoted by leading scientists in nearly every country. In America, eugenics supporters included biologists at Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Columbia, Stanford, and our National Academy of Sciences. Today, the Darwinian roots of eugenics tend to be downplayed, but the Darwinian rationale for eugenics was explicit in the writings of eugenicists themselves. For example, Harvard geneticist Edward East insisted that eugenic tenets are strict corollaries of the theory of organic evolution. While Princeton biologist Edwin Conklin, you can see him on the cover of Time magazine, similarly advocated for eugenics as a way to undo modern society's violation of natural selection, the great law of evolution and progress. So again, the eugenists thought that we were sinning against natural selection by helping, through our compassion, people to survive that Darwin's process would have normally killed off. And so they were advocating eugenics as a way of saving us from our sinning against natural selection. The impact of eugenics in America in particular, but also in Europe, in Russia, even there were eugenics laws, I believe, in Japan, elsewhere. The impact of eugenics on American public policy was far-ranging, including laws on who could marry, immigration restrictions, as we already talked about, on races considered lower on the evolutionary scale, and forced sterilization of those considered less fit in Darwinian terms. In America, 60,000 women were sterilized against their will so that they couldn't bear children in the name of eugenics. Elsewhere in the world, the impact of Darwinian eugenics was even more horrifying. Germany's eugenics movement sterilized hundreds of thousands of people and murdered 300,000 disabled children and adults, many in gas chambers dressed up as shower stalls. In fact, it was during the eugenic killings of the handicapped that the Nazis developed some of the methods they used to murder millions of Jews. So if you know anything about the Holocaust, you know about this horrific way of gassing people to death, but you actually make it look like a shower stall, and you tell them, well, you're just going in to have a shower. Then you lock them in and you gas them. What most people don't know is that technique was first perfected on handicapped kids in the years leading up to the Holocaust against the Jews. And that was a direct, the killing of the handicapped and disabled children and adults was was directly connected to the eugenics movement in Germany. After the general public learned about the atrocities committed in the name of eugenics in Nazi Germany, Darwinian eugenics was widely discredited. But Darwinism has continued to degrade the value of human life in other ways, particularly in areas of abortion and infanticide. So scientists and political activists alike have appealed to Darwinian theory to justify abortion by claiming that babies in the womb are not fully human. And how do they do this? Well, they've actually invoked an idea known as embryonic recapitulation. And interestingly enough, this idea also goes back to that German scientist Ernst Haeckel. So I showed you earlier a diagram of human evolution that Ernst Haeckel popularized. But this diagram is probably the diagram that Ernst Haeckel is most known for. And it promotes this idea of embryonic recapitulation, which is the argument that human infants replay the history of evolution as they develop in the womb. Supposedly we go through a fish stage, then a lower mammal stage, and more before we finally reach the state of a human being. Thus, if someone aborts an infant while she is still in the fish stage, it's no more immoral than killing a fish. You can see this. So here, if you look at the very top line, the idea is that all of the different mammal classes, whether it be fish, salamander, tortoise, chickens, hogs, calves, rabbits, and human beings, are supposed to start the same way. And then they only differentiate near the very end. And this is supposed to prove that we're developing from a common ancestor. And again, the recapitulationists argued that we were following basically the evolutionary history of our race in the womb. Now, embryonic recapitulation is junk science. And it has been discredited now for decades, even among evolutionary biologists. And that has, however, has not stopped this argument from being invoked repeatedly as a justification for abortion in public policy debates. And I'll just share a couple of examples, one from the United States, another from someone in England. So in the 1980s, this recapitulation argument was cited by this guy, who was University of Michigan geneticist James Neal. James Neal was one of the world's top geneticists at the time. He was a member of America's National Academy of Sciences, and yet he went before our United States Congress and basically argued that you shouldn't declare that human life begins at conception, because we know that humans replay the history of evolution in the womb. And so, if you kill them during the fish stage, you're not really killing a human being. This was one of America's top geneticists who was making this argument in the 1980s, decades after it had been refuted in the scientific community. But so that even shows that scientists may be making claims that have been discredited by other scientists. But then we have this guy, Christopher Hitchens, now dead, a journalist from England who wrote a very popular book, an international bestseller called God is Not Great: How Religion Poisons Everything. Well, in part of that book, he claims that in utero, we see a microcosm of nature and evolution itself. We begin as tiny forms that are amphibian. No, we actually don't. But he was using this argument to defend abortion. And so this argument is still being made today. Another Darwinian justification for abortion focuses actually on natural selection. This man is Planned Parenthood official Alexander Sanger, and Planned Parenthood was founded by Margaret Sanger, who was also a eugenist, and it has an international Planned Parenthood council that actually does this in other countries, so it's not just American. So Alexander Sanger, who's a grandson of Margaret Sanger, argues in a book just a few years ago that human-directed abortion is the product of natural selection. In his words, humanity has evolved to take conscious control of reproduction and has done so in order to survive. We cannot repeal the laws of natural selection. Nature does not let every life survive. Humanity, uniquely and to its benefit, can exercise some dominion over this process and maximize the chances for human life to survive and grow. What he's saying there is that abortion evolved in human communities through natural selection because abortion helps promote the survival of the fittest. And so he's making an explicitly Darwinian argument in justification for abortion. Darwinism has also fed into the justifications for euthanasia and infanticide. Prominent Darwinians believe that humans aren't inherently more valuable than any other animal, so how we treat animals, we should also treat humans. So this is Jerry Coyne at the University of Chicago. He's one of North America's most prominent evolutionary biologists. He has argued on his blog for legalizing infanticide for babies with biological handicaps. Why is this? Well, here's what he wrote. After all, we euthanize our dogs and cats when to prolong their lives would be torture, so why not extend that to humans? We kill dogs and cats, so why not humans? Well, what's behind that idea that somehow dogs and cats and humans are fundamentally the same? Well, Coyne recognizes that the reason we don't do this, that we don't treat human babies like puppies or cats, is that because of a view of human beings that Darwinism has yet to completely overcome. I'm quoting from again. He said, "The reason we don't allow euthanasia for newborns is because humans are seen as special. And I think this comes from religion. In particular, the view that humans, unlike animals, are endowed with a soul. When religion vanishes, as it will, so will much of the opposition to both adult and newborn euthanasia," unquote. Princeton University bioethicist Peter Singer is another Darwinist, originally I think from Australia, who has endorsed the killing of handicapped human newborns. Singer claims that, and I'm quoting from him, quote, "The life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee." Now, where does Singer get this view? Well, he's told us. Here's what he said in an interview a few years ago. "All we are doing is catching up with Darwin. Darwin showed that we are simply animals. Humans on the one hand, had imagined we were a separate part of creation, that there was some magical line between us and them, Darwin's theory undermined the foundations of that entire Western way of thinking about the place of our species in the universe. Now, I don't agree with Peter Singer about much, but I actually agree with him that Darwin's theory has tried to undermine the foundations of this way of thinking that humans are special. Similar Darwinian devaluations of human life can be seen among some radical environmentalists. Now, I think there's a justified environmentalism, especially as a Christian, that we should treat creation with care and love because it's the creation of God, and that we should treat and steward our planet well. So I'm not attacking that. But there is a form, at least in the United States, and I think in some other Western countries, of what I would call a radical Darwinian environmentalism that uses this as the care for creation as a justification of diminishing humans. And if you want to find more on that, there's a book by one of my colleagues, Wesley J. Smith, called The War on Humans. There's also a documentary on that available for free on YouTube, who has documented how again, some among in the environmental community, among what I would call extremists, ground their views in a visceral hatred of humans and the denial that humans are special or unique. And let me just give you a couple of examples. This man is an evolutionary zoologist at the University of Texas, which is one of America's large research universities. His name is Eric Pianka. He argues, and I'm quoting from here, that humans are no better than bacteria. And then he also says, other things on this earth have been here longer than us, and so they have a right to this planet too, and that includes the wasps that sting you, ants that bite you, scorpions, and rattlesnakes. Pianka goes on to criticize humans for, again, I'm quoting from him, sucking everything we can out of Mother Earth and turning it into fat human biomass. He urges the reduction of Earth's human population by up to 90% and calls on the government to confiscate all the earnings of any couple who has more than 2 children. And now this last quote from him. You should have to pay more when you have your first kid. You pay more taxes. When you have your second kid, you pay a lot more taxes. And when you have your third kid, you don't get anything back. They take it all. So I guess your children then are supposed to starve because the government takes it all from you. Not only are humans not special, according to these radical environmentalists, we are an enemy to the earth. So you have Sir David Attenborough in Britain, who's one of the world's most respected wildlife filmmakers. In a 2013 interview, he denounced humans as a plague on the earth. According to Attenborough, humans are an enormous horde that are fast outgrowing the planet's space for them, and he particularly targets Africans as a plague. In his words, famines in countries like Ethiopia are inevitable because there are, quote, too many people there, unquote. By the way, factually, that's not true. Most famines on the earth are largely the result of government policy. It's not even, it's an interaction between environment, but there's right now more than enough food on the entire earth to feed everyone. Most of the places where you have massive famines and starvations, it deals much more with government policy than it deals with the population size or the actual the environment of droughts and things. Because you can have a drought and still get food from elsewhere. So his idea that famines in Africa are inevitable because, quote, there are too many people there, unquote, is just not true. Underlying the radical environmentalist hatred for humans is the Darwinian rejection of human dignity and human uniqueness. And Christopher Maines, who was one of the early leaders of an environmentalist group that's active all over the world called Earth First, actually explicitly says this. He says, why are they doing what they're doing? Why are they so anti-human? Darwin, and this is a quote from his book, Green Rage, Darwin invited humanity to face the fact that the observation of nature has revealed not one scrap of evidence that humankind is superior or special or even particularly more interesting than, say, lichen. That's a type of sort of moss-like thing, lichen. So humans aren't superior or special or even more interesting than lichen on trees. This is, I think, an absurd argument, but this is the sort of rationale, the Darwinian rationale that fuels some of these people. This kind of Darwinian hatred of humans motivates some really extreme people today. So in 2010, you had eco-terrorist James Lee in the United States, who took staff of the Discovery Channel cable television network hostage in the United States. And why did he do that? Well, in an online manifesto, he called on the Discovery Cable network to talk about evolution, talk about Malthus and Darwin until it sinks into the stupid people's brains and they get it. Saving the planet means saving what's left of the non-human wildlife by decreasing the human population. That means stopping the human race from breeding any more disgusting human babies. I'm not making this up. This is how these people justify things to themselves. They themselves are, you can debate, is this a fair, implication of Darwin or not? This is the worldview, though, that they're citing. And then one other thing, I talked about Sir David Attenborough. Where does his claim that humans are a plague come from? Well, it likewise grew out of a Darwinian worldview. According to Attenborough and some of his other writings and speeches, in the past, natural selection kept humans in check by killing off, humans that were especially defective and biologically not fit. But modern society undermines natural selection by saving the sick and finding ways to feed more and more people. This is according to Attenborough. And it's because of this that we need to find new ways to reduce the human population if the planet is to survive. So, Darwinism has undermined the value and sanctity of human life in multiple ways. Ideas really do have consequences, and I think Darwin's idea has had culture-shattering consequences. Let me go on, though, to some other these two other areas. I won't go in quite the depth that I went in the first area, but the second main impact of Darwin's theory on human life and culture has been its corrosive influence on morality and human accountability. In a Darwinian worldview, morality is reduced to pre-programmed behavior in service of physical survival. In the words of Darwinian philosopher Michael Ruse and Harvard evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, morality, in a Darwinian view, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. In an important sense, ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. They're not criticizing this, by the way. That's their view. They're actually saying, based on Darwinian science, this is what morality is. It's just an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. As a result, human free will is non-existent, to cite the words of a Cornell University professor named Bill Provine, now deceased. So morality is just an illusion, basically pre-programmed into us, and so we don't even have human free will in the era of morality because of this view. It's interesting that attacks on personal accountability and responsibility have featured prominently in Darwinian accounts of human behavior over the past century and a half. For example, Darwinism played a key role in the development of what was called at the time the New School of Criminology by Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso and others in the 19th century. These criminologists tried to find Darwinian explanations for why people engaged in crime, even labeling some persons born criminals because they were supposed to be throwbacks to an earlier stage in evolutionary history. Basically, that in the earlier stage of evolutionary history, it made sense. People were pre-programmed to triumph over others by beating them up and killing them and plundering them. And so these born criminals are reflecting their evolutionary history. They're a throwback to an earlier stage of evolution. This was an argument commonly made by criminologists in the late 18th, early 19th, and early 20th centuries. But this diminishment of free will and personal responsibility, the idea that we're born criminals, is not the only way Darwinism has impacted morality. Darwinism also provides a robust biological justification for moral relativism. According to Darwin, in his book The Descent of Man, specific moral precepts develop why? Same reason anything else develops among humans, because under certain environmental conditions, those moral precepts, those moral teachings promote survival. But here's the caveat. Once the conditions for survival change, then so too do those dictates of morality. And that's why we find in nature both the maternal instinct but also infanticide, both honoring your parents and killing them when they become feeble. Natural selection chooses whatever behavioral traits best promote survival under existing circumstances. So it's not that a Darwinian understanding of morality necessarily promotes immorality. It's that it makes it very difficult to condemn as evil any human behavior that has persisted. Because every trait, in Darwinian terms, by definition, every trait that continues to exist, even among a subpopulation of humans, really has an equal right to claim nature's sanction. Presumably, even antisocial behaviors like fraud and pedophilia and rape continue to exist among human beings because, in a Darwinian view, they were favored at some point by natural selection and therefore have some sort of biological basis. Now, of course, you could still still condemn such behaviors if you had some permanent moral standard independent of natural selection. But the existence of such a permanent moral standard outside of natural selection is precisely what Darwinism denies. Now, for the most part, Darwin himself did not press this relativistic analysis of morality to its logical conclusion, but he certainly laid the groundwork for others who came after him, and his ideas have helped reshape how people think about morality. Nowhere has the Darwinian view of ethics had a severer impact than in family life and human sexuality. I think the thinker most responsible for the breakdown of traditional sexual ethics in Western culture was probably Harvard-trained evolutionary zoologist Alfred Kinsey. Most people don't know that Kinsey, they know that, he dealt with sexual behavior in humans. They didn't know that he was actually trained as an evolutionary zoologist, and that is what gave him his way of looking at sexuality. He adopted a thoroughly Darwinian approach to sexual morality, arguing that any sexual practice that could be found somewhere among mammals, if you could find it among any mammal anywhere, well, that means that it could be regarded as normal mammalian behavior and be regarded as unobjectionable. Today, you have many evolutionary psychologists have gone beyond mere sexual relativism and are affirmatively arguing against monogamy. They claim that we were bred by Darwinian evolution to have multiple sex partners, which means that we are programmed for promiscuity and infidelity. In their view, the very idea of faithful monogamous marriage contradicts our biology and therefore must be abandoned. One prominent evolutionary psychologist to advocate this view is Christopher Ryan, co-author of the New York Times bestseller Sex at Dawn. In his words, marriage in the West isn't doing very well because it's in direct confrontation with the evolved reality of our species. Ryan actually says he wants to save marriage by making it consistent with Darwinian biology. So what would that mean? Well, in his view, that would mean redefining marriage to include multiple partners at the same time. Some might argue that if you redefine marriage in that way, you're actually destroying marriage. In the name of saving it, you're redefining it so much that it's not marriage anymore. Certainly, if you have a biblical view of marriage, I think you would argue that. Okay, a final profound impact of Darwin's theory has been in the area of religion, where Darwinism has supplied a potent scientific rationale for atheism. Now, I want to be clear, Darwinism doesn't logically necessitate atheism, but it certainly does encourage it. Think about it. If nature really supplies proof that the history of life is the product of an unguided process, then that would seem to make an atheist worldview much more credible. I think that's why so many scientists have made unguided Darwinian evolution a cornerstone in their case for atheism. You have Oxford University biologist Richard Dawkins, who famously claimed that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. You have Harvard evolutionary biologists saying that the existence of a God who directs organic evolution and intervenes in human affairs is increasingly contravened by biology and the brain sciences. You have evolutionary psychologist David Barish in the United States saying, the more we know of evolution, the more unavoidable is the conclusion that living things, including human beings, are produced by a natural, totally amoral process with no indication of a benevolent, controlling creator. And then in a nationwide survey that we conducted of American atheists and agnostics, so these are in the United States, nearly 7 in 10 atheists and more than 4 in 10 agnostics said in the survey that unguided chemical evolution and Darwin's unguided sort of mutation natural selection mechanism have made the existence of God less likely for them personally. Similarly, more than 7 in 10 atheists and nearly 4 in 10 agnostics in America agreed with evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins' statement that, quote, "the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference." But interestingly, and in fact, maybe even more disturbingly, Darwinism's impact on religion has not been limited to just atheists and agnostics. Darwinism has also reshaped how many Christians view God, especially at Christian colleges and universities in the United States and Europe, where scientists and theologians have tried to revise Christianity in order to try to make it compatible with Darwinism. Because Darwinian evolution is by nature unguided, these theistic Darwinists often downplay or reject the idea that God actively directs the development of life. For example, he just died within the last year or two, Anglican priest and physicist John Polkinghorne wrote that an evolutionary universe is theologically understood as a creation allowed to make itself. Now, he was not criticizing this view. He was saying this is the way it is, that we have to understand as that God wasn't really directly directing everything. He created something that allowed it to create itself. So that's on the Protestant side. Roman Catholic biologist Kenneth Miller of Brown University says that mankind's appearance on this planet was not preordained. We are here as an afterthought, a minor detail, a happenstance in a history that might just as well have left us out. And then we have the late George Coyne, who was at one point the astronomer of the Vatican, claiming that not even God could know with certainty that human life would come to be. And why was this? Because evolution is unguided. And so not even God can know that human beings were going to come to be. I just submit that this is a very heterodox, this is not the historic biblical view. In the historic biblical view, God knows full well what's going to turn out. And he actually guides it and leads things to particular conclusions, like human beings. And this idea that God himself didn't know how things were going to turn out, or that he sort of allowed a creation to create itself, is very anti-biblical. But where is this coming from? It's not really coming from readings of the Bible. It's coming from an effort to try to make Christianity more palatable to Darwinian evolution. So other theistic Darwinists repudiate the biblical doctrine of a historic fall, which is the idea that the first human beings were originally created good and then fell into sin through a voluntary act of disobedience. According to Christian physicist Carl Giberson, who was co-founder of a group called the Biologos Foundation, he argued in this book, Saving Darwin, that since human beings were created through Darwinian evolution, they were essentially sinful from the very start, because selfishness drives the evolutionary process. So there was no fall. There was no original good creation in his view. This is also a standard belief among many theistic Darwinists. Still, other theistic Darwinists challenge the idea that God's handiwork in nature is observable, especially in biology. And so we have Christian geneticist Francis Collins in the United States, who's very famous in the United States for being both a Christian and a biologist. But he claims that evolution could appear to us to be driven by chance. I'm quoting from him. But from God's perspective, the outcome would be entirely specified. Thus, God could be involved in the creation of all species, while from our perspective, this would appear a random and undirected process. In other words, God makes the history of life look random and undirected, even though it really isn't. Now, I guess in a way, this view is better than the idea that God just doesn't direct at all. And Francis Collins, I should say, is unclear in his own views. He sometimes gravitates between suggesting that God doesn't really direct things, But then when he does say, well, maybe God did direct things, but he made it look random and undirected, I'd say even that second option isn't particularly biblical. Contra Francis Collins, for thousands of years, Jewish and Christian thinkers believed otherwise, maintaining that God's design could be clearly seen throughout nature. And we don't have time to go into all of that, but I think the biblical teaching is clear. In Romans, in Psalms, even in some of Jesus's discussions in sermons, where he talks about the lilies of the field and basically how God feeds the birds. Really, Jesus there is talking about how you can actually see from nature something about the purposes of God. Okay, so to sort of wrap this up and begin to sort of wrap this up, I think Daniel Dennett, who is a Darwinian philosopher, has aptly described Darwinism, let me go back, as what he calls a universal acid. What does he mean by that? Well, he calls it a universal acid, and he thinks this is a good thing, by the way. It's a universal acid because it dissolves traditional ideas about morality, human responsibility, and God. And I think that Daniel Dennett is right. Without question, Darwinian theory has had a pretty significant corrosive impact on those beliefs. But where I'd like to end is that thankfully the story doesn't end there. Actually, not quite there. While Darwinism has eroded our culture's respect for human life, in recent decades, I would argue scientists and philosophers at the highest level have started questioning Darwinian orthodoxy. One of these scientists was my friend, and he's deceased now, but the late Philip Skell. He was a renowned professor of chemistry at Penn State University in the United States and a member of America's National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Skell spent much of the last decade of his life publicly raising questions about the evidence for Darwin's theory. He wrote this, Darwinian evolution has functioned more as a philosophical belief system than as a testable scientific hypothesis. This quasi-religious function of the theory is why many scientists make public statements about the theory that they would not defend privately to other scientists. Or consider the comments of Nobel Prize-winning physicist Robert Laughlin at Stanford University. He's gone so far as to declare, evolution by natural selection has lately come to function more as an anti-theory, called upon to cover up embarrassing experimental shortcomings and legitimize findings that are at best questionable, and at worst, not even wrong. Then there's atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel, who in 2012 published a noteworthy book with Oxford University Press titled Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. To be sure, Nagel is still an atheist, but after examining the evidence, he has become completely unpersuaded of Darwinian explanations for mind, morality, and life itself. Indeed, he attacks Darwinism as, and I'm quoting from him, a heroic triumph of ideological theory over common sense, and he concludes that the Darwinian worldview is ripe for displacement. But it's not just that scientists and philosophers are now questioning Darwinian theory as ever before. Science itself, I would argue, is revealing stunning evidence that life is the design rather than an unguided process, and it's been shedding light on how humans are truly special. One of my colleagues at Discovery Institute is Australian biologist Michael Denton. Michael has both an MD, so a medical degree from Bristol University, and a PhD in biochemistry from King's College in London. His research into retinal disease led to the identification of the gene used in the first successful gene therapy trial at Moorfields Eye Hospital in London. So he's quite a distinguished scientist. Michael Denton has increased my own sense of wonder about both our universe and about ourselves. He writes about how our world is exquisitely fine-tuned for life to exist in ways that go far beyond what chance processes could create. And everyone of you now who's watching this is breathing in oxygen. If you're not, then I don't know how you're living. But we take that for granted. We take it for granted that we're breathing in oxygen. But we shouldn't. Here's just a little taste of why we shouldn't. I have a clip here from Michael to show this.
As you're sitting there, You're breathing there, relaxing. You're using up 250 mils of oxygen every minute. It's incredible. That's the amount of oxygen you need to maintain your energy levels. And you need about 20% or so oxygen in the atmosphere to feed your metabolic needs.
The problem with needing so much oxygen in the atmosphere is that oxygen is dangerous because it's so reactive. If you have too much of it in the atmosphere, you can have spontaneous combustion. Fortunately, the form of oxygen prevalent in our lower atmosphere is diatomic. That means two atoms of oxygen typically combine together into a molecule. Diatomic oxygen happens to be much less reactive so long as the temperature is below 50 degrees centigrade or 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
And this allows, in fact, quite a high level of oxygen in the atmosphere without spontaneous combustion.
The properties of diatomic oxygen mean our atmosphere has just the right level of oxygen we need for living. Not too little and not too much.
If you raise the level of oxygen much more than 20%, perhaps certainly more than 30%, you'd have raging spontaneous fires all over the place here, okay?
An equally serendipitous property of diatomic oxygen is that it does not absorb heat, which has helped prevent a massive increase in Earth's surface temperature that would wipe out life as we know it.
If it had been a greenhouse gas, forget it, we wouldn't be sitting here. In fact, oxygen absorbs no incoming radiant heat because it's a diatomic molecule. So it goes on and on and on. There's one coincidence
after another. After, of course, those of us who are Christians would not say they're coincidences, but it's not just that nature is amazingly set up to make life itself possible. It's also that we human beings are truly exceptional in numerous. Here are just 5.
Our brains have intellectual powers, including mathematical reasoning, that far surpass the capabilities of other animals. The physical design of the human larynx enables us to utilize a much broader range of vowels and consonants than any other mammal, facilitating sophisticated verbal communication of complex ideas. The human hand is better adapted than any other known appendage for the intelligent manipulation of the physical environment. The human body and mind seem to be optimized in a variety of ways to make us the only animal who can harness the use of fire, which opened the doors to technology. Finally, humans live on a planet that seems optimized for scientific discovery. Our clear atmosphere and location in the galaxy enable many of the observations that have fueled modern science. Humans are not only equipped with a potential for self-reflection and scientific reasoning, they were placed on a planet that allows for that potential to be fulfilled. Far from being insignificant specks living on an insignificant planet, humans are truly a privileged species, inhabiting a home that seems to have been prepared for their benefit.
In my view, unique fitness of the universe for carbon-based life and beings like ourselves is one of the major discoveries of 20th century science and one of the major discoveries of all time in the area of design, religion, science, and all these sorts of things. The human form is something significant in the cosmic order, and that's a scientific finding. It's implicit in astrobiologists thinking about looking for carbon-based life somewhere else and looking for oxygen on a planet. The 20th century have shown that human form is not some irrelevance, not some freak of nature. It's deeply significant. For me, I can't think of any discovery that's going to come in the 21st century which could be more significant than this, actually. It's a very significant finding.
So I love that what Darwinian science has tried to take away from humanity, new discoveries in the sciences have been restoring. When people encounter these discoveries for the first time, it can be life-changing. Every summer in Seattle, pre-COVID at least, Discovery Institute would bring together undergraduate and graduate students from all over the world to study the compelling evidence of design in nature. Here you actually see a picture from that with Dr. Mike Behe, who's one of my colleagues at Discovery. And when we do this each summer, we would see how the real evidence of nature can give a lifeline to those who have been told, wrongly, that we're the products of a blind process that did not have us in mind. I think of one alumnus of our summer program who later became a PhD student at one of America's leading research universities. He shared with us how he grew up loving science until he started studying it at a university in his home country. He's actually from another country that I'm not going to name. But in his home country at the university, he was repeatedly told by his professors that the material universe is all there is, and that science shows we are just the results of purposeless accidents. Then he found some videos online featuring some of my colleagues, and he said that for the first time in my life, science does not mean materialism for me. And I started to see the signature of a designer. Well, that's my hope for you. And I hope that you have learned something from this talk, and I look forward to engaging with you now with some questions and sort of a Q&A. Final thing I want to highlight, if you are interested in the things that I talked about and want some of the documentation for some of the things I talked about, Discovery Institute actually does offer a free 39-page digital download called Darwin's 3 Big Ideas That Impacted Humanity, that you'll find many of the ideas I talked about and with the references for further information. And you could get that at discovery.org/big ideas. So with that, I'm done. And thank you for joining this session.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. West, for that staggering lecture, to be honest. It's a quite extraordinary, the consequence of these ideas. I love history, and I love studying philosophy and the history of ideas, and it's amazing for me to see how an idea like Darwinian evolution can really impact society in the way that it does, and that it's not some trivial affair. We have a few questions here for you. So I want to just start. I had a few myself I wanted to ask you. First of all, I wanted to just talk a bit about the impact of these eugenics movement on Nazi Germany. And are you aware of any information during the Nuremberg trials, if during the trials the defendants were actually appealing to eugenics as a science in terms of the justification for what they had done to the Jews and other people that they saw were not fit to continue to live?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. There's certainly during the Nuremberg trials, with regard to the killing of the handicapped, there were references to, well, eugenics was mainstream in many other countries. In fact, I think one of the people did actually point out that the world's first eugenics sterilization law was passed by the state of Indiana in the United States in the early 1900s. And so they did argue that Germany there was following what the rest of the world had gone on. I think I'm not... if people want to know a lot more about the Nazis and how they drew on Darwinian thinking, I think I'd suggest the books, really a trilogy of books by historian Richard Weikart, who's really an expert in European intellectual history. From Darwin to Hitler, Hitler's Ethic, and Hitler's Religion really are the definitive scholarly works that go into that. I'd say on the eugenics part, that was really tied, even apart from the Nazi Party, to the German scientific and medical community.
Yes.
When it came to the killings of the Jews, although they involved scientists and stuff, I think that was more directly connected just to the Nazi Party. So in the Nuremberg trials, the first wave of trials were, I think, for the political criminals who were engaged in the extermination camps and other things. But it was in the later, they had a batch of Nuremberg trials that focused particularly on the doctors and scientists, where they did focus particularly on the eugenics killings. So they did make, according to Richard Weikart, they did make some of the same eugenics arguments to get rid of the Jews. So they did, but he would be the more expert on that than I would be.
Okay, excellent. I found that very interesting. So my question is, I was as towards the sort of the latter half of your talk, you begin to throw out a number of very, very, very famous scientists, from Watson to Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, David Attenborough, and a lot of other reputable scientists. If the influence of Darwinian evolution we can show that this has had a negative impact, and deadly in the cases of some, and horrendous. Yet that idea seems to be in the minds of many of our world's leading scientists now. My question is, where is this going then down the road with people like, for example, Peter Singer, who is arguably the most famous ethicist in the world? His book, Practical Ethics, I think is probably the most commonly used book at college levels. I know my wife, when she was teaching in the UK at high schools in the UK, the ethics texts are written by Peter Singer. I just wanted to see what you think of this now, because Peter Singer argues for justifies infanticide. I'd just be interested to see what you think of that. It's ruthlessly consistent, but where's this going?
I think where it's going, I think where it's going is Singer is part of this, but also some of again, I want to make clear, I'm for protecting the environment. I'm for environmental stewardship. But I think you see it in Peter Singer, and you see it in certain radical environmentalists as well, this hatred towards human beings and the view that human beings overall are a dead weight. It used to be in the eugenists, well, there are certain human beings who are a dead weight. Well, now you have people like Peter Singer, and really it's all humans are a dead weight, and we shouldn't be preferring them to non-human animals. And if you want to talk about an idea that would actually catastrophically harm human beings, it's that idea that humans aren't unique and special. It's one thing to say that as humans we have a duty, because we're created in the image of God, to treat animals and other life forms, to cherish them because they're also created by God. It's another thing to say that we're equivalent to a mosquito and have the same rights or only have no more rights than a mosquito. And so what you're seeing in some places, actually this is particularly impacting Africa, because the newest incarnation of this, which I didn't get into, is what are known as nature rights. And so where you actually have in both South America and in America, and so it's all around the world, the argument that, well, nature has more rights than human beings. And so so for example, if you have a hydroelectric project that could help millions of people in Africa or South America or America with electricity and other things, well, the river will sue. Of course, it's not the river suing; it's human beings that to say, well, you can't do that because that's harming my right to the river's right to existence. Or in Switzerland, you actually have a law where decapitating, picking a wildflower is tantamount to decapitating a flower, and it can be a serious crime. Once you start blurring and really say that there's no distinction, or it's even worse, that other animals and life forms are actually in some sense more important than humans, then a lot of public policies that are done to help humans become challengeable.
Yeah.
And you're actually seeing that now in some places. So
is it fair to say then that this whole idea of speciesism is definitely attached to this Darwinian concept of
very much. The idea that, no species can be considered more special than another because we're all the product of the same blind accidental process. So all you can do, you could exert your power over other species, so I guess in that way you could say that, well, I'm fitter because I've dominated, but really underlying the Darwinian worldview is there's no way to say that one is more special than another at basis.
In Peter Singer's book on practical ethics, because I challenge my students to read it and say, look, if you can deal with Peter Singer, then you're going to pretty much be prepared to deal with pretty much any secular ethicist that shows up along your path in his book on practical ethics. But he has a functionalist definition of a human being, and so once the embryo once the child has reached a certain level of functionality, self-awareness, so forth and so on, then we can now give it its citizenship, and then it's entitled to all the rights. But up until it reaches that stage, it's not entitled to that. How would you respond to that functionalist view of human being? Of course, one of my questions would be, well, who sets the criteria? Number one, which scholars decide what is the criteria to be the functions? But how would you respond to this kind of functionalist view of human beings?
Yeah, I would in two ways. That presumes a couple different things. One thing, it really does presume in the background this Darwinian view of nature that everything is just the product of an accidental process, and so there's nothing special about human beings. We're an accident of history. And so, but if that's not true, and I think there's a lot of scientific evidence that that's not true. There's a lot of scientific evidence. I mean, I'd encourage people to watch also on YouTube a documentary I gave an excerpt from it called Privileged Species that goes into much more depth. Humans are special. And there's a lot of scientific as well as other evidence of that. If you think that's the case, then you could argue, well, from day one, whether or not in the womb is part of a process. I mean, if you're a human embryo, you're not going to turn into a pig or a dog or a chimpanzee. You're going to turn into a human. And if there's something sacred about that, or something special about humans, interfering with that process, that artwork in process. So, the baby that's in the process of development, that if you don't interfere with it, is going to develop into a full-blown, human being. You're doing something awful because you're actually interfering. Now, if you actually think that a human in the stage, 30 days in the embryo is in a fish stage and no more different than the fish, then you could justify the sort of things that Singer is talking about. But if you actually have a view of the human person as being crafted and special from eternity, his argument sort of falls apart. The other thing is, and this is this veers more into religion, but I think there's also a scientific basis that can be argued, is it presumes that human beings fundamentally are just our matter in motion. And I would argue, just even apart from the Bible, I think from the biblical view, clearly human beings are made for eternity. So we're not just, so there's something real us that survives death. So we're not just when our physical brain cells develop, that there's a real us that is there from the beginning. But let's just take it from the medical point of view. In the last 2 decades, there has been, and it's somewhat controversial, but I think the data is interesting, the whole area of near-death studies and of life after death experiences. I think you could debate what it shows, but I think one of the things that it seems to show is that the claim that life is tied just to our material constituents and that there's nothing more to human beings than that is hard to substantiate even medically anymore. And certainly I'd say in a Judeo-Christian, in a biblical worldview, we know that's the case because humans have eternal souls. The Bible is very clear on that. Now, there are some modern Christians who've tried to deny that in the same way that the theistic Darwinists have tried to deny that God really directs things, but that actually shows the impact of this worldview, not of the Bible. The Bible is really clear, it's certainly in the New Testament, that we have eternal life and that there's more going on than just our physical being. And so if you have a view that humans have souls, then whether it's 2 days after conception or 9 months after conception, you are taking the life of something that's really important, and it doesn't matter if they haven't fully developed all their physical capacities. So I'd say human souls, and then the idea, just the more generic idea, if nature, including human beings, are the product of an intentional process that did have us as an end in view. When you interfere with that baby wherever in the process, you're interfering in a process that was laid out for a purpose a lot longer ago. It's not a happenstance process that, and it's not equivalent to the process of a dog or a chimpanzee. It's a process that was designed to create human beings. And so interfering in that process is a problem. It's only if you have this accidental view that it says, oh, well, it's just like killing another animal that doesn't yet have, mental capacities.
Yeah, it's disturbing for me to have to read some of these scholars and some of their ideas. And that they're taken so seriously. I wanted to ask you now, because so much of certainly the last 3 years, the culture's been dominated by this the social justice movement, and I'm just interested to talk about two concepts there that
Sure.
you want to because tied to this. The first one would have to do with within the things that the social justice scholars are saying is this kind of fact that science has been used to oppress and to dominate people. Are you aware, is this the argument coming from the social justice movement, saying that, look, the science was used for sterilizing black people? Is that the argument are you aware of their arguments they're making along these lines?
To some degree, and I said they're right on that. I mean, I'd say, believing in the Bible, human beings are sinful, and so scientists are just as sinful as other human beings. And so science, just like politics, just like religion has been misused, science has been misused a lot to harm people. And I'd say now, science has also been used a lot to benefit people. So what I would get at, it's not science, and it's not just generic humans misusing. It's, well, what scientific ideas? And so I do happen to think that, say, Darwin's idea is one, it's not the only one, that has been used particularly in a dehumanizing way because the underlying arguments are dehumanizing. But I think their critique of the abuse of science coming out of some, I think, is exactly right. Now, where I would disagree is that doesn't mean that there aren't also many benefits of science, and that just because, I mean, it's a more complicated argument, but when you're talking about specifics, certainly in the era of racism, although racism and racial prejudice preceded certainly Darwin, the development of science and the Enlightenment was one part of it was very dehumanizing to non-white humans. And I would say the Christians who bought into that were basically contradicting the Bible, because the Bible is really clear that all humans came from the same root, created by God. And of course, as Christians, we believe that in Christ there is no Jew or Gentile, male or female. I mean, we're all one in Christ Jesus. So, I mean, any Christians who bought into those scientific views, and I'd actually point out, I think some of the people today, Christians who think that they're so sophisticated in basically rolling over and adopting a theistic Darwinian stance because, well, that's what they think science, the scientific elites say. Well, many of the Christians who had a false view on race and were at the time were embracing the scientific views of their time. I mean, if you look in the American South, I can't speak as well in Africa. I know a little bit about in Africa, but similarly, certainly in Western colonialism in Africa, and we actually have a scholar who is working on British colonial theory in Nigeria, where it was pretty clear that the British authorities were treating different tribes in a way based off of Darwinian ideas about inferiority. So I think there is a lot of truth there.
Okay, that's interesting to me as well. And the other second issue with the social justice movement is one of their there's a number of, as a menu of ideas that fall under the social justice movement. One of it includes their view of family, and you find that some of the social justice scholars, and this goes back to their kind of the Frankfurt School as well, is that there's kind of this attack on the family, abolition of family.
Yep.
Sophie Lewis and these kinds of things. But I was just interested in seeing that, because I didn't realize that some of these Darwinian guys are also advocating for a view of family where, you just, a marriage is basically, well, I don't even know what a marriage would mean then, because basically it's just a promiscuous society with everybody sleeping around. And that's just what a family is to these guys, But then the abolition of family as well within the social justice movement. I don't know. Can you unpack that for me?
Yeah, I can. That's an excellent, really point. And I would say the great irony of what is called social justice now is that it has been impacted by many of these Darwinian and materialist ideas that I think are antithetical to true social justice. So on the one hand, they talk about social justice in some legitimate ways and point out some legitimate issues, but they've adopted actually their underlying philosophy, both through Marxism and then Marxism tied to Darwinism, actually undermines any concept of justice, of real concept. When most people think of justice, when most people hear the word social justice, and they're thinking, well, there's something really true about, and certainly when most Christians hear it, they want appropriately that that there is a moral right and wrong, and that all people have dignity, created in the image of God, and because those things are transcendent truths that are right, we should be held accountable to that. They're exactly right. What they don't realize is that the conception of justice in the mainstream social justice crowd is actually, that's not their view of justice. Their view of justice is that it's all a power trip. There really is no social justice. There really is no justice in their view. It's all a struggle for power. And where do they get that? Well, if you actually unpack it, it's not just Marx, it's also Darwin. So Marx wrote on this. Actually, I write about some of this in my book, Darwin Day in America, but I've learned more since then. But so when Darwin read Marx read Darwin, and both Marx and Engels thought that Darwin provided, and actually explicitly said this in their letters to each other, that Darwin provided in natural history the basis for the Marxist view. Now, what did they mean by that? They meant that Darwin's law talk about that everything came about because of a struggle for the survival of the fittest, that provided the basis in nature for what became the class struggle. So in their view, Darwin showed how things are. The reality of how things are is it's nature, tooth, and claw, red and tooth and claw, and it's the struggle for survival and the struggle for power, and that's also what human society is. And Darwin provided in nature the grounds for understanding. That's what brought us about. Now, Marx said elsewhere that his goal was not to understand the world, it was to change the world. And so Darwin tells us where we're at. This is the way the world is at. And so we want to surmount it. But how are we going to surmount it? By our own survival of the fittest, which is the class struggle, where we're going to prevail over the people who oppress us. But the problem is that in their worldview, the only thing really that exists is oppression. And so they're basically, their form of social justice is to replace one set of oppressors with another. Because that's what the world is. That's the only thing that exists, going back to Darwin. And so you can show...
It's a survival state of affairs.
Correct. And so they think that's wrong because the capitalists and everyone else have oppressed the poor, which I think they're right. There was a lot of oppression of the poor. But what people miss is that in the Darwinian Marxist ethos, the only thing that exists is the struggle for survival. And so you can replace one set of oppressors, but the Marxist utopia is provided by installing another set of oppressors, basically. It's because they show that they ultimately have the power. And so today, when they're talking about all these power differentials, they're right that people misuse power and that a lot of people have used science, they've used religion, used other things in the service of power. And let me just say, you don't need Marx to know that. I mean, the funny thing about the people who go back to Marx is people for thousands of years, you go back to Plato's dialogues, you go back to the Bible, people understood that people misused power and that that's part of the human condition. The unique thing and the really pernicious thing about Marx and the modern social justice movement that follows it is that that's all there is. So there really is, it should be called social struggle or social struggle for power, because it's not about justice. At the end of the day, they highlight injustice, but really injustice is all there is. And so what they're offering you as a solution is, well, let's have a different set of oppressors, because that's all there is. They're not offering you what, say, Martin Luther King or frankly Nelson Mandela in South Africa or others offered, is that, well, actually there's some transcendent truth about human dignity, and that's what we're aspiring for.
Yeah.
When you believe in a transcendent standard, then you have the option of understanding that everyone is a potential, could go against that, and you have to hold them accountable to it. But if all there is just oppression, it's basically, are you going to be in the group that gets out on top?
Yeah, yeah. And I can see how if you adopt that strictly, then when it comes to, for example, family and sex.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. Let me get with that even more direct ties. So the other thing that Marx and Engels really appreciated about Darwin was that he provided a scientific basis for the materialist worldview. And so that's if all that exists is just matter in motion. They thought Darwin helped prop that up, because before there were always materialists before Darwin, but it was always on the fringe, because you couldn't see how could human beings be created just matter in motion. There was just too much there. Darwin provided, in their view, a convincing scientific rationale for materialism. So that allows you to attack religion, which of course Marx did, and also attack other things. Morality. What is morality? Morality is just the struggle for, and this is sexual morality, the struggle for survival and power. So there is no one right way of patterning your family relationships. There is no, what monogamous marriage is a tool of the previous class structure, and there is no transcendent,
Yeah, and you can see what's going to cascade from that, because that just leads to the objectification of women in society, because we start to treat people like things. And yet everybody's complaining about the objectification of women, yet the very philosophy and these ideas on which they're standing, you have no other option except that that's what cascades from this kind of view of human beings and in treating them like animals and these big foundational assumptions,
And it guarantees more social injustice, because, and we've seen this in America, and it's whites, it's blacks, it's anyone. In America, we developed, and I'm not against social welfare programs. I actually think that they're good when done right. But we actually, in the 1960s and 70s in the United States, adopt the approach that it was a good thing to have households that were headed, but single-parent households were a good thing, not a tragic thing that we tried to help. It was a good thing, and that men were expendable. Well, the really bad thing about that is if you want to guarantee someone to be stuck in long-term intergenerational poverty, extol the idea that our model should be single-parent households. I mean, just as a practical matter. So one of the most unjust policy prescriptions is the breakdown of the family, because for people of whatever race, and again, this is not to say a lot of people, you can't, people die, partners are not faithful. That's true. So I'm not knocking anyone who is in that situation, but if you extol that as that's what we should be aspiring to, is single sex-headed households with children, that is virtually a guarantee of further social injustice. You're actually, and so it's a lie, and it's a pernicious lie, and it matters.
Yeah, no, that's these things. These debates are going to only intensify in the future with all of these battles that we see going on. I've been trying my best to try and become more informed on this issue of the family. I've really seen how critical discussions on the family and how the structure of the family is under attack, and been really helped by listening to some of the work of Thomas Sowell, who's been quite helpful in understanding that. So I recommend Thomas Sowell to all of those listening on YouTube this evening. There's a question here, Dr. West. You quoted one scholar as saying something to the effect of time being ripe for a replacement of Darwinian evolution. What would the replacement be for those who are committed to materialism?
Yeah, so the person who said that is Thomas Nagel, who is a non-materialist atheist. So I think for him, the replacement would be a modern version of Platonism. So, the idea that there are deep structures and transcendent truths that just happen to be in nature and the universe eternally. I mean, really, this is the big option. This is the big conversation in civilization, is do things ultimately go back to a personal beginning or an impersonal beginning? And you can have an idea of an impersonal transcendent beginning, but even as in fairness, so I would distinguish between atheism and materialism. You can have an atheist form of non-materialism, a type of Platonism. Now, I would say that Thomas Nagel is honest enough that he actually says, and it goes on to say in his book, that he's not really sure that idea would even be coherent. So, because he doesn't really want to go the theistic route, but he is honest enough to admit that the impersonal beginning is not impersonal, non-materialist beginning is a bit problematic. And I think it's problematic because where does personality ultimately come from? I mean, we're human beings. We can see that there are personal beings. And so if the ultimate origins of the universe are from an impersonal beginning, even if it's transcendent, even if it's these ideals and other things that are not personal, how do you get personality? And so I think that the argument of a personal infinite, what Francis Schaeffer used to call the personal infinite beginning, is stronger, but that's the other option. It's these deep structures in nature. There's also a school in biology called structuralism, which is sort of similar, that basically there's these just deep structures of things that always existed that things sort of gravitate toward. I'd say I'd far prefer that if I'm to the materialism, because once you get on the grounds that, well, things aren't just happenstance, there is something that things are going towards, and that there is intentionality or some sense of purpose, even if it's impersonal, then you get to have the discussion. Well, but how do you account for personality? How do you account for personal beings? And that's, I think, a much for most people, they'll understand that it's a stronger case for a personal beginning as opposed to an impersonal beginning.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting to see. I have read Thomas Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, and it was a really interesting read, and it's interesting to see where some of these debates are going. Dr. West, we have taken a lot of your time now, so I think we're going to wrap up now, but maybe if I can just give you, to conclude for us, maybe just a word of encouragement or any final thoughts on this for those listening in, where we are in the times in which we live, and on some of these issues. Maybe some words for us. I'm now going to speak as just who I am. I'm not speaking for Discovery Institute. I do happen to be a Christian, and I think that ultimately God rules the universe, and that Jesus tells us to fear not. Don't let your hearts be afraid. And why? It's not because bad things aren't going to happen. They happen all the time. And certainly in the biblical account, they did. But it's because we know who holds the future and who holds our eternal destiny. And really all he asks is us to be faithful. And not to win. I don't know what's going to happen 2 years from now. I don't know what's going to happen 30 seconds from now. I just a couple of days ago, I found someone who I knew actually who lives in Africa, who was a close friend, who found that he had just died from COVID a couple of weeks before. I hadn't heard from him and wondered. We don't know, but I know where he's at. He's in with Jesus because he was Christian. So I'd say be faithful. We're called to be faithful and to also be true. And that's more important than being successful. It's more important than winning the world. Win and be a true witness among your own friends and among the people who you're called to be influencers. First of all, your kids, if you have children. A lot of Christians seed, at least in America, they basically hand over the upraising of their kids to the rest of the culture. Even Christians do that.
if you do that, it's not going to be pretty. You're going to find out that, when your kids get a certain age, you're not going to recognize them. So so first pay attention to the people in your sphere of influence, your friends, your colleagues, your kids, and be a light to them. And then God will work on people's hearts. And that's all he asks you to do. He's not going to judge you on whether you're successful or not, but whether you're faithful or not. And whether you faithfully use the talents he's given you, and then he will see you through, and because I do think Jesus is with us even now through the Holy Spirit, and that you can trust him, and so no matter how bleak things may see, the future really is there is a purpose for the future, and God is in control. Having said that, he wants us to be working in cooperation with him, not to be rebelling against him. And so I think we need to take that seriously. And I would say that that has benefits here and now to our relationships. I'd say if you base your life on truth, that does have positive benefits here and now. It has benefits for human flourishing here and now. But of course it has benefits eternally too. So remember Jesus' words, especially words about fear not and be not afraid, because he's overcome the world. I think that's true. Remember, though, that we are called to be faithful, and that God will take care of things from there, but we are called to be faithful.
Thank you very much, Dr. West, and I can say this, we should definitely like to hear from you in the future on some more topics. I know that you speak on many other topics, but this has been a fantastic lecture. I really appreciate it. We've been eager to hear from you, and hopefully in the future we can actually have you come and visit South Africa to tour our beautiful continent and this beautiful country.
That would be beautiful. Yeah.
And to come and share your knowledge with us. Yeah, we would very much like it. But once again, on behalf of
thank you
very much. Do take care.
Thank you.